Our first speaker today, I'm very excited about. It's David Ewan Duncan. He's the author of When I'm 164. Sorry, I get that song stuck in my head. The New Science of Radical Life Extension and What Happens if It Succeeds. He also wrote The Experimental Man, what one man's body reveals about his future, your health, and our toxic world. Today he's going to bring us a far-ranging talk on new medical and health technologies that are already allowing us to push the boundaries between sick and healthy to potentially enhance humans and possibly increase human life expectancy. What are these technologies? What are the implications, good or bad, if they work? And he is an author. He's written for the Daily Beast, the New York Times, Wired, and others. And this talk of convergence on health, IT, and bioscience, I'm looking forward to it. Let's give a big, warm welcome to David Ewan Duncan.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out this morning. This looks more like San Francisco, where I live here in Austin, than what I would expect to have happen in Austin.
The coding has not kicked in yet.
So I am going to give you a little bit different perspective than some of what I saw yesterday. I'm basically an observer participant in what's going on with body hacking, all of these new leading edge technologies. So as a journalist, I have this incredible privilege to hang out with great scientists, great technologists, engineers, others that are designing our future, basically. And that's how I learn. And one way that I tell stories, and I started doing this, almost a dozen years ago, is I try out the new technologies. Anything that basically won't hurt me. In fact, all the different stories I'm about to share with you and all these different technologies that I've checked out, sort of test-driven, if you will. The one dictum was, do no harm to me. Although I did violate that a couple times, as you will see. Not too harmful. I'm still here standing, mostly intact. So I'm going to start out, though, asking you a question. So I know you all kind of stumbled in. Maybe you're out late last night at the wormhole party, which was pretty cool. But I would like you to participate here for just a second, if you will. Are you ready? Are you okay with that? Boy, that was enthusiastic. But I know it's morning. There we go. All right, there's always one. All right, this is kind of the ultimate question. And by the way, one thing that I get to do as a journalist too, and I'm really interested in, is the implications of all these technologies. All the amazing things we saw yesterday, you're going to see today. And the great thing about this meeting is there are a lot of discussions about this. I think there's a session after this on ethics. What does all this mean? How is it going to affect us? What are we going to look like in 50 or 100 years? That's what I'm fascinated with. So the ultimate question really is, why are we even doing this? So in the 164 project, the 164 project, I give talks all over the world, and I've asked over 50,000 people the following question, which is, how long do you want to live? And I am really kind of throwing that at you. You may have thought about it. Some people obsess about it. Some people don't think about it at all. And I'm going to give you 4 possible answers here, and then I'm going to ask you to vote on each one. 80 years, which is the current life expectancy in the West, in America. That's about how long we live now. 120 years, which is a little bit of a jump there, but that's as long as human beings have lived as far as we know. So that's still within the natural realm, but way out there. 150 years. Now, no one, as far as we know, has lived 150 years. So this would mean probably some technology that would allow you to do this. I'm not telling you there's going to be, but you are free in this little thought experiment to imagine that there might be a technology, and then forever. Okay? And some of my Silicon Valley friends who want to live forever insisted that I add this to the survey. I find it more of a metaphysical question, because as far as we know, the universe will not last forever. But anyway, I will put that up there for you. So how many people want to live 80 years? Okay, I can't really see you, but a few, okay, a few, okay. 120 years? Okay. Actually, I think that's more, all right. 150 years? Okay, that's probably about the same. I can't quite see you all, so how about forever? Oh, yeah. Okay, this is what I would expect at a body hacking conference. Um, so at the end of the talk here, I am going to share with you how the other 50,000 people voted when we get to that section. Meanwhile, I'm going to share with you 3 areas that I report on that I find kind of begin to build this story towards what the future is going to look like. And so we'll have 3 sections. The first one I've done a lot more work on, you as data. The second one is enhancement, and the third one is radical life extension. So the last 2 will be a little shorter here, but let's just jump right into this, you as data. Now what I mean by this, literally you, personally, your family, this is my family, it could be your family, and this is what we look like on the outside. You know, if you met my family, that's what they would look like. This is what we look like on the inside. So these are all of the different aspects that are studied right now, and we're trying to learn about. It's the proteome, it's the genome, it's the microbiome, and how the environment feeds into all of these systems, the brain, etc. And by the way, this is about data. And I give a whole talk called BioBabble, too much data, too little understanding, and giving you parts of that here. But this is an unbelievable amount of data. The things we were seeing yesterday, you know, this obsession in Silicon Valley with data. And in fact, data is the greatest invention of humanity, I would argue. Our ability as humans to create information. This is what we do. I mean, it's beyond the Parthenon, the Great Wall of China, the pyramids. This is what we do. And we do it pretty well. In the last 50 years or so, you know, we've gone from pencil and paper to digital and beyond, and it's extraordinary what we've done. In fact, this is what we're producing per day right now, 18 exabytes of data. This compares to 1995, just 21 years ago, when the entire internet, or the entire web, was 0.03 terabytes. So that's where we are. And by the way, I'm going to show you in a minute all the data I've collected on myself is 10 terabytes. So I have personally, one guy, more data than existed in the entire world just 21 years ago. And just to show you a lot of zeros here, right now in the world, there are 6.6 zettabytes, which is 10 to the 21st. And that's a lot of zeros. And this, I just changed this slide actually yesterday for the talk. It used to be 2.1, which is from 2013. So we have more than tripled the data in just 3 years. So, and by the way, we're just at the cusp of getting health data. That's been late to the party. Imagine when everybody has all the data that I'm going to describe to you and more. And it turns out, as I said, that creating data is easy, but we're really in need of a second great invention. I think the 21st century will be all about interpreting that data. How, you know, what does it mean? How do we make sense of it? That's what's hard right now. It used to be hard to create the data. It's much easier now. Now, it's hard to figure out what it means. So I'm going to rifle through a whole bunch of ways that we create data, health data. We have patient records, we have sequencing, we have genetics, we have some kind of cool ones like gene editing, which I'm both hopeful for and fearful for because it's so easy now to edit the genome. We've got scanning technologies, we've got nanotech, we've got the proteome, we've got the microbiome. I stuck this up from yesterday, James Young, which I found absolutely fascinating. I hope you all were here to see his talk about his, as he said, sci-fi prosthetic arm, which is totally cool. We've got, when you get into the hospital, you've now got data being generated that used to be on clipboards, is now on iPads. Doctors are using devices a lot more for things like imaging. You've got Watson, artificial intelligence. And then in the health realm, you've got Fitbits, you've got glucose monitors, you've got the Apple Watch, you've got little devices you stick on your head that relax you and create data. Scanadu, which is a company that I've been trying out. They actually call this a medical tricorder, just like in Star Trek. And you stick that on your head and it measures a bunch of stuff. This is my friend Rachel Clayman, who actually wears all of these devices 24 hours a day, she says. I don't know, you kind of wonder, shower? I don't know, whatever. Anyway, but just to give you a little hint of why we need to learn to interpret this, Rachel has, probably 40, 50 devices on here, some of which are the same device, replicated, and almost all of them produce different data on the same things. So in a consumer reports kind of way of looking at it, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make that right. And I sometimes talk about the business implications of this, and I'll just give you one little slide on this. This is basically what we're talking about is the realm of personalized health, how we stay healthy. And Price Waterhouse did a report back in 2009 that suggested that this market was around $200 billion back then. They said, predicted that it would be $450 billion in 2015. It actually was $750 billion. So that is a huge number. And when you think about all the technologies we're discussing here, this is not a business-oriented meeting, but just think about the sheer amount of money that's involved with this, for better or for worse. So all that testing I did, we called it the Experimental Man Project. And I wrote a book, and I'll give you the URL where you can check it out. So here's what I did. And that is my sort of EEG Rastafarian look. So I have 60,000 DNA markers identified, or genotypes annotated, as they call it. My full genome I had done in 2010, which was pretty early. I have over 1,000 toxins inside of me. We all have little trace elements of pesticides and metals, or tiny, tiny little amounts. I did a National Geographic story on this. It's hard to believe, 10 years ago. And they actually sent me on a chemical autobiography of where I would have been exposed to things like DDT, because I grew up in Kansas when I was a little kid, where they sprayed DDT, which has been a long banned pesticide, but it stays in the environment and inside of you a very long time. MRI and CT scans. I've had my brain in an MRI scanner way too many times. It's actually extraordinarily boring. You're just laying there. And I even fell asleep a couple times, which the researchers were not very happy about because it costs several $100s an hour to use these things. Proteomics, microbiome, and then more recently, wearables, apps, things like that. So all of this created literally tens of thousands of data points. And as I said, about 10 terabytes of data, which actually, if we all had 10 terabytes of data, which we're hoping to do someday perhaps, we would be in something called yottabytes. And I hope somebody someday can tell me where yottabytes came from. If you look it up on Wikipedia, it just says yottabytes. It doesn't say, is there some guy named Yoda? Is this, did they misspell, Yoda from Star Wars? I don't know. But this is a really big number, 10 to the 24th. That's got 3 more zeros than the zettabytes I showed you earlier. And there is a little side thought here on how we even deal with all this. Something like 6% of the electricity in the US goes to servers right now. And we produce a lot of electricity in this country. So, just thinking about that, because the cloud is actually really all these giant server farms, which produce a lot of heat and et cetera. So anyway, this is what I get to do as a journalist. We play around with these little kind of practical details. Okay, that sounds cool, but unfortunately, I am no longer the #1 guy, though, with the most data. This man, Larry Schmar, who I actually saw in San Diego a couple days ago at UC San Diego, he has about 30 terabytes of data. That's partly because he, and pardon me saying this, but he collects his poop every 2 days and does a microbiome, and he's been doing this for 5 years. He has irritable bowel syndrome, and that's actually his microbiome behind him on this giant screen that he invented. He's an engineer and actually an astrophysicist. So he has more data than I do. Mike Schneider at Stanford has even more data at 40 terabytes. But he's the head of clinical genomics at Stanford and just has more toys than I do to play with this, which is sort of annoying that he has that advantage. But anyway, so what does all this mean? I'm going to give you just a few little results here that give you an idea of both the potential and some of the issues with this data. I have a 50% increased risk for a brain aneurysm. Okay, that sounds kind of scary, right? Like a little vessel exploding in your brain, maybe causing a stroke. But what that really means is it's a probability based on one genetic marker. And first of all, one genetic marker doesn't really tell you that much about you, because you are a lot more than one genetic marker. But almost all of the genetic testing that you hear about is a population study that takes one marker or a cluster of markers and compares one population that has had brain aneurysms with those who don't. And they don't take anything else into account. And there might be a whole lot else going on in my body that might prevent me or even make it more of a risk than that. It also, 50% increased risk means that as a white male, I have a 1 in 200,000 chance of having a brain aneurysm on average. That means I have a 1.5 in 200,000. So that does not sound quite as scary. Another category of genetic testing is pharmacogenomics, which means you have genes that help you process or not drugs. And so warfarin is a blood thinner that they give you after surgery to keep your blood from clotting and getting stuck in your brain and various other places. Very common in surgery, but it's been known for a long time that certain people are sensitive to it. So you have to be very careful how you dose it. Turns out I am a hypermetabolizer of warfarin. So you would not want to give me the full dose. It would actually cause me great harm. And so we have a genetic test now that can tell you that. And that's got, by the way, a lot more validity because they have actually run clinical data through that, longitudinal data on, in fact, millions of people. So that has a lot more accuracy to it. And then there's this category of DNA around behavior. And they test all kinds of things, moods and anxiety and et cetera, et cetera. Risk-taking, there's a bunch of genes associated supposedly with that. You're getting into some, really difficult territory here. Can you really actually make predictions like that about DNA? Because the environment and other factors play a huge role, obviously, in many of these issues, and including behavioral. But I came out high risk for low empathy. But I always give this little thing, but I don't care what you say. But it was a small study in Germany. It was about 150 Germans. I don't know, I have one German ancestor that I know of. Maybe it's relevant to me, maybe not. Maybe Germans, well, we won't go there. Anyway, okay. I love Germans. So let's move into the toxin area. Just a couple of readings on that. As I said, I grew up in eastern Kansas. Actually, when I was a little kid, they were still spraying DDT. This long-acting pesticide, it was banned in 1975. It actually shows up in my body at about 50% higher level than the Centers for Disease Control national mean. And this is no longer a probability, by the way. This is an actual level. So but again, this is so trace and so small, we don't really know what it means. They always say that the dose makes the poison. Like plutonium would kill you instantly, even a microscopic speck of it. Other chemicals at very low doses, who knows? So another one is mercury. I had 3 times the CDC level when I was tested, but 3 weeks later, this is, again, the dose makes the poison, and also time. Your body clears mercury very fast. I had just eaten a couple of big fish. Actually, it was an experiment that we were doing. Large fish have high levels of mercury. Little fish are fine, you should eat them, but swordfish, other big fish have lots of mercury in them. And so in about 3 weeks, if I had another measurement, I would probably be normal because your body clears mercury very fast, as opposed to DDT, which is still around after all these years. MRI scans, there is an MRI test you can take. It's very expensive. It can give you some prediction on whether you have Alzheimer's or not. Basically, it's measuring the beginning of plaque buildup before you show any symptoms. So that's being used now. It's very expensive, and it still has some issues, but it's being used now as a predictive tool in some cases. And then one of my favorites, again, they test behavior in MRI scans. And these are functional MRIs that measure the blood flow in your brain. You're given some sort of stimulus, usually with goggles attached to a computer. You might see something horrible or something wonderful, and they measure the blood flow in your brain. And so I came out normal for greed. And I don't even know what that means. I also came out normal for altruism. I mean, what's normal for greed? I don't know. Anyway, and most of these tests, because it's so expensive in the MRIs, you're being compared to about 25 people. And those of you who know anything about statistics know that that's pretty irrelevant. And they tend to be grad students. So anyway, I guess compared to 25 grad students, I have normal greed. And then heart attack risk. This is where it gets interesting, because a lot of what I was trying to do with this experiment is, what does this all mean for me as a, as a kind of every person? Can I learn anything? Because as we know, medicine is very siloed. And in fact, all the different technologies sort of remain really apart. And as you'll see, I've devoted a lot of my time and energy recently to trying to work on that problem. Because we are not separate like that image I showed you earlier. We're not just a brain floating over here and a genomic system over here. We're one big dynamic system. So I took one disease area and tried to do as much as I can, get every test possible, and bring it all together. So I did heart attack risk. But this is where it gets interesting, because I did get some predictions. But this is all my data. I won't go through it all. But some of this is traditional data like cholesterol. Some of it's genetic, which is a little more out there. But I got everywhere on the map. Predictions of low, medium, and high risk for heart attack, and which obviously shouldn't happen. It should be one or the other. I did, on one very complex algorithm that was a model that was being developed on heart attack risk, I got a very high risk factor for that compared to what my doctor would tell me with current standard of care, which was very low. So I don't even know what all that means. It's a little scary to walk in and have somebody tell you have a 70% risk of heart attack in 20 years if you gain a half a pound a year. It was all tied to weight. But if you don't gain anything, you have a 2% risk factor. Now, in the future, these are the kind of predictions we're going to get. And in a way, it'll be up to us to decide which trajectory do we want to go on. And everybody will be different. At the moment, though, it's still really up in the air how accurate all this is. So my favorite genetic marker, I didn't bring my coffee out here, the caffeine fast metabolizer gene. Okay, how many of you can drink coffee before you go to bed and you're fine? Okay, it's always about 25% so about 25% of us carry this marker. And I do, and I love it. I love coffee. It drives my friends crazy, though, who have to stop drinking coffee at 3 o'clock when I have a cup of coffee after dinner. It's like, they look at me like, are you kidding? You're going to be up all night. And I'm like, no. And that's because my body processes caffeine very, very fast. I still get some other symptoms. If I drink too much, I get jittery. But what this gene affects is the wakeful center of your brain. So it just simply doesn't stay in your body long enough to stimulate that wakeful center. And then there are a lot of metrics around Fitbits and things. I've actually come to like Withings, but there are lots of others. And this is just some of my steps. And apparently I have a frowny face, which means I was very bad that week. And then this is another set of data from Scanadu, which measures heart rate, blood pressure, things like that, and blood oxygenation, and so the oxygen levels in my brain. And this is that little medical tricorder device that you saw the little kid putting up to his forehead. Now, again, this is exciting, and someday soon I think this will mean a lot. It's already beginning to in some cases. But you see that red dot there for blood oxygenation? That indicates I'm dead. So I'm not dead. So I was able to sort of truth that one really quickly. But 80% blood oxygen is not really very compatible with life for a human. So that was an inaccurate reading. So there's still some work to be done, again, on this area of how do we use this data, how do we make sense of it, how do we make sure it's accurate. And I'm going to dig a little deeper in a couple of areas here that I spent more time on. And again, trying to put this data together. The book and the project were split up into genes, environment, brain, and body. The body part was where we tried to tie it together. So in this case, we're trying to tie together an environmental factor, which is mercury exposure, and genetics. And I really, literally, nobody really does this, or at least I thought nobody did it. There are a few people that are working on it, but it's not common. The geneticists don't really talk to the toxicologists and vice versa. In fact, they have a whole different way of approaching science. The toxicologists approach it by, how does mercury do its, terrible things? What are the mechanisms there? How does it, mess with cells? What are all the things that happen? So that's mechanistic. Geneticists come at it from statistics. They do these population studies I was telling you, and then they work down towards mechanisms. So you would think that there could be a nice little meeting in the middle, and in fact, that's what happened when I looked into this mercury in genes. So genetic sensitivity to mercury. We all know that some of us can go out in the sun and get sunburned within 5 minutes. So other people can go out all day and they're fine. And same goes with virtually any environmental input, with the food that you eat, everything. So mercury is no different. Some of us are more sensitive to it than others. This has been known actually for centuries. Some people who, like the Mad Hatters, back in the 19th century, they used to make felt hats, and mercury was part of that. And they called them Mad Hatters because some of them went Looney Tune. They went crazy with the mercury in their brains. But curiously, not all did. So we've known this for a long time. So I went out to see, how do I fit into that with my genetics and my environmental testing? Am I sensitive to mercury or not? Or protective? Some people are protected. And these are some of the results. I'm not sure you can even see that, so I apologize for that. But these are different species of mercury, as they say. Methylmercury is a little different than elemental mercury. But these different genes affect things like mood. It's mostly neural, but it also can cause asthma and cancer. And this is all pretty preliminary data. That little red C there on the GC, that's genetic code, suggests that I am at elevated risk for BDNF with mood disorders and things. So again, I may not care what you think of the empathy, but don't get me upset, okay? This is a little scary here. This is the mercury concentration in the US from 2010. So you can see it collects, basically mercury that gets inside of us starts in coal-burning power plants. It gets up in the atmosphere, and then it sometimes goes for hundreds of miles before it settles back down on the Earth. It's particularly bad in the ocean because it falls in the ocean, it's absorbed by plankton, and then the fish start eating it, and that's why those big fish are more dangerous than small fish, because they eat the small fish. It's called bioaccumulation. And this is just 3 years later. So let me go back here. You can see, like say, California is pretty clear here. This is just in 3 years. And we are actually, there's a huge debate at the federal level now about reducing power plant emissions over mercury. So you can kind of see why this is a bit urgent, at least in my view. But there are hot spots, there are places. I'm not really sure why it's white on the bottom there. Maybe that their measurements didn't cover that. Because I think Austin is right on the edge of that. I can't even tell exactly. Looks like it's not as bad as, say, northern New Mexico. Anyway, so I actually took this several steps further. I've been recently becoming more of an entrepreneur. I'm still doing a lot of writing, but started a company called Ecoios, and we're developing a product actually around mercury sensitivity called MercuryWise. And hopefully in a few months you'll, through your doctor, be able to order this. It's a genetic test. And that's what the kit looks like. We send you a little swab kit, you send it into our lab, and you get a result and it's for children, by the way. If your child is particularly sensitive to mercury, and then we gave, even more important, we give you a bunch of ways to avoid mercury so your child isn't exposed. And unlike a lot of that data that I showed you earlier, which is statistical data, population studies, this is actually a clinical trial that this test is based on. And this is really important because most of medicine doesn't use genetics because physicians and others need some kind of evidence beyond just a statistical study. How does this work in the real population? And the genetic testing that's used regularly in medicine, like say, there are a couple of good tests for breast cancer, BRCA1 and 2. Those have been clinically validated, meaning that they've been tested in a population and you test them over time to see if they develop the condition, in that case breast cancer. And that one's a very obvious one actually, BRCA1 and 2. It's only a small percentage of breast cancer cases, but it's very pernicious. So if you have that, it usually runs in families. It's about, I forget there's a new number for that. It used to be about 12% of cases. But anyway, so having clinical data is really important. And this is what the results were, which is kind of scary, to be honest with you. 1 in 5 children in this study, by the time they turned 17 or 18, they were between, I think it was 8 and 10 when the study started, a 7-year study. The kids who had these at-risk genes, there are 5 genes, and the highest, you had a 6-year developmental delay on things like attention, memory, these batteries of neurobehavioral tests. if you're exposed to mercury. And these are very small levels of mercury, like from eating fish, or the silver fillings, which some of you probably still have. Those are half mercury, and they're still actually put in kids' mouths every year. It's 40 million fillings, amalgam fillings are put in every year. So 1 in 5, 3 to 6 year developmental delay. I'm not sure why that doesn't say 6. It should be 3 to 6. But the good news is that you can avoid mercury pretty easily. And we have a bunch of ways that we tell you how to do that. But this has a strong effect size, and the p-value, basically the accuracy of this is very high. So this is what a report looks like. I actually came out medium risk. So I, funny enough, don't even really like fish. So there may be some defensive mechanism that we have to keep us, I'm okay with it, but it wasn't that hard for me to just avoid fish. I do, however, still have several amalgam fillings in my mouth, which I should probably have removed. And we call this ecogenetics, by the way, which is, again, this idea of trying to combine things. And the triad of life, it's genes and traits, which are things like diseases, and the environment. So another little deep dive here is around stem cells. This is actually me as stem cells. And stem cells naturally occur a few days after conception, and when the embryo is forming, and stem cells are what all the other cells grow from. There are 220 some odd types of cells in the human body. They all come from this little cluster of cells and grow into hearts and lungs and brains and things like that. This particular stem cell line does not come from a few days after conception. This is a process called induced pluripotent stem cells. And this is how this works. I sent some blood into a company in Wisconsin that then reverse engineered my white blood cells, which have DNA in them. And it's actually been pretty easy to do this. They reversed them back to an embryonic-like state. So you go back to where they originally came from, essentially. And then they can take those cells and grow them into any cell, which is totally wild. And they grew them first into heart cells for me. And I don't know if you can tell, but those are actually beating. Little heart cells, my heart cells in a petri dish. And we ran a little experiment to see how different drugs, which are very toxic to heart cells, like most chemotherapies, would affect my heart cells. And so we tried Gleevec, chemotherapy for a number of cancers. And it turned out that my cells had a normal reaction. So, hopefully I will never need Gleevec, but if I did, this could be a way to test or screen drugs to see, if they're going to be particularly toxic. I mean, it's way too expensive and still a little experimental to try this, say, in a hospital. But someday we will all have a stem cell line like that, and if you do need these different drugs, they can test them in your cells before they put them in you. We also, let me go back here because it's kind of cool. These are brain cells, which we recently made. And these cells on the left are just normal cells, my cells. The ones on the right have been treated with SSRIs, which are used for depression. And you can't really tell all that much difference there, but there actually is a pretty big difference. So that drug does affect your neurons. So what have I learned from all this? Not much. I mean, I've learned a lot about the technologies, which as a storyteller is what I set out to do. But as an individual, I'm still really waiting for this interpretation. There are a few things that have been interesting and important. I mean, I took that heart attack risk seriously enough that I changed my diet around and a few other things. But mostly, this is still yet to be interpreted. And it will happen. That should be, but it will, not but I will. So a few issues on this area before we move on to enhancement. You as data. As I mentioned earlier, I kind of used the Babel, Tower of Babel, which is really where we are right now. It's, if you know the story, everybody spoke the same language until they tried to build a tower to heaven, and then God created language, according to the biblical story, and caused they couldn't talk to each other, so they couldn't finish the tower to heaven. But basically, I'm using it in the sense that, everybody's kind of talking in a different language and needs to actually go reverse the Babel story back to speaking the same language. This need for an interpretome, the need for something I call fusion, which other people call convergence. I just think fusion is a cooler word, but we need to obviously bring all this together in a kind of dynamic way. There's also a gap, as I'm do a lot of reporting and talk to both engineers and biologists, there's this extraordinary philosophical gulf between engineers and biologists. And I actually wrote a story recently, a column, that biologists are from Venus and engineers are from Mars. I mean, when you talk to them, they just fundamentally have different points of view on how we're going to solve all these problems. Engineers assume that the human body is like a giant computer, and we'll just figure it out pretty quickly. Biologists sort of laugh at that because they know that we actually don't know that much about the human body. Someday, maybe the engineers will be right, but probably not anytime soon. Then there's issues of regulation, law, and ethics, which I write a lot about, which play in here. And again, it's happening, but very slowly. So, oh yeah, this is new. I'm actually going to write an updated version of the original Experimental Man book. And any of you that have cool experiments that won't hurt me, I'd love to hear about them because I'm going out in the world again to really update this. Most of my experiments were done back for this book in 2009, although I continue to do some of them. But obviously a lot's happened since then. And so help me out here. So enhancement, I'm going to go through these next couple of areas here pretty quickly, and then we'll have some questions if you all have any. So I wrote a series in the New York Times about enhancement, which was kind of fun. We got a lot of interesting responses. Kind of general, actually about doping after the Lance Armstrong thing, various ways to read brains like we saw yesterday. Worked with Stephen Hawking. This is kind of cool story. It's a single electrode that this guy's invented an algorithm to be able to read brain waves, and Stephen Hawking is trying it out. And then how long do you want to live? And then there were several others over the years, not only in the New York Times, but in other publications. And this is another survey. I ask you the question about how long do you want to live, but I also sometimes do a survey about how far would you go in enhancement. And this is particularly apropos to this meeting. We asked a group of Silicon Valley people how far they would go. And surprisingly, 20% of them said not very far, basically, whatever's available now. On the other end of it, about 19% wanted to just download themselves into a computer and get rid of their frail human body. And then you have in between, we were seeing some of the bionics yesterday. There were very few people that would willingly move into bionics, which would mean removing their natural limbs. And then on about 28%, the largest one, would take a super drug that would make them a little bit smarter, a little bit stronger. And then we had stem cells. So I'm not going to ask you to vote on this, but it's interesting to think about as we're talking about body hacking and all of that. How far would really, if you really had these options, like a little menu like that, what would you actually do? And it's interesting how some people don't think about that. Other people, again, obsess about it. So there you go. So some of the technologies that are happening around enhancement, this is Amy Mullins, who is missing her lower legs, but was a track star and is now a model and an actress. And she said something wonderful to me about, as an actress, and she has a leading man who might be tall or short, she can adjust herself. And Hugh Hare, who is at MIT Media Lab and also is missing his lower legs and designs prosthetics for wounded warriors and others, he told me that he's more enhanced than we are, and that he's not only enhanced mechanically or bionically, but he is socially enhanced because he can adjust his height, he can do all different things that we can't do. So interesting to think about that. We've got exoskeletons which are coming online. They're still pretty clunky. This is a cochlear implant that helps people that can't hear. And by the way, all of these technologies are for people who are disabled or ill or have had some deficit. And the curious thing about, and what my series was about, is that many of these technologies in the near future will be applicable to healthy people potentially to enhance themselves, and also those who have had deficits as well. I mean, they could push beyond. Yesterday this was discussed a little bit. I mean, what if you go from having a deficit to actually being enhanced compared to people that don't have the deficit? So these are all issues that are going to be coming up. Although the gentleman who's in this picture here, Michael Korost, I asked him, well, could you just turn that up and like hear a pin drop across the room? And he said he's tried that, but you hear everything. And he said it may be that we don't want to enhance hearing much beyond what we have. This nature has decided this is what we can absorb. I mean, there's so many sounds in this room that we can't hear right now. And if you turn that up, it might actually drive you crazy. So that's kind of interesting. This is a woman who had a stroke 13 years before this picture was taken. She became paralyzed from the neck down. She's had a brain implant, actually surgically implanted in her motor cortex, and she was able to operate through a computer. I asked this question yesterday, actually, to the panel. Would they do it? But she did do it, and obviously paralyzed. But for the first time in 13 years, she was able to, with a prosthetic arm, which was not attached to her, move a canister of coffee and, as she said, have a sip of Joe for the first time under her own power, which was pretty wild. And these are, by the way, hooked up with wires at the moment, but the scientists working on this are going to make this wireless and kind of embedded in your head so you actually wouldn't even see it. And again, I don't think any of us are going to have brain surgery right now, especially since this doesn't really work very well. But who knows in the future? We've got a lot of genetic fixes. We have drugs out there right now. I did a whole series of articles on Adderall and steroids. And when I looked into minor use of these drugs, like literally, apparently millions of people use Adderall occasionally if they need to stay up all night. A student who has finals week, or people that have to get out of something at work and they're up all night, several nights in a row. And these people take this and they don't get addicted. They don't keep taking it beyond these occasional needs. And there's no evidence really either way that minor use of Adderall is bad or good. And this piece was really that I wrote was saying we should be testing this to understand how it works in healthy people if millions of people are using it. But of course that's not ethical now in how we test drugs. And steroids are the same. We hear all these scary things, but people who use very low levels of steroids, there's not, again, millions of people, probably tens of millions of people. There's not a lot of evidence that it causes that much harm, but we don't know. It could be long-term harm. We're not even running the studies to find out. You also have in the realm of enhancement, this has been mentioned, but this is a trachea that was grown from stem cells, and these have been successfully implanted in a few people who are missing a trachea or get them damaged. Bladders is another one. These are very simple organs, though. They don't have a lot of vascular complexity or nerve complexity. But this is actually happening as well. It's really literally a few dozen people have had them. It's still extremely experimental. But this is where we start getting the spare parts. So someday, your heart begins to break down. One way that you not only could be fixed, but possibly enhanced is through this technology. And then some issues around enhancement. First of all, it's coming, and I don't have to tell you all that, but a lot of people get a little freaked out when I talk about this. We need to make certain decisions as a society on all of this technology, which I'm not sure that we're really keeping up with. What does it really mean? Who controls the software? I think somebody mentioned this yesterday. I mean, does Google or Apple or I don't know, the federal government will put out a court order that your encrypted data in your brain needs to be released, to law enforcement or something. I mean, these issues that are playing out around smartphones and things will play out around us at some point. So there are Frankenstein issues here too. Something could go wrong. Who knows how this will come out? And then what does it mean to be a human, which is a broad philosophical question. So just quickly here, and then we'll go to questions. Ultimately, a lot of this, whether we intend it or not, will lead to radical life extension. And in this little book I wrote, it was a TED book. It's very short. If you have a short attention span, it'll just take you a couple hours to read. But you can find it. It's an ebook. But there are animals. Nature has actually created some very long-lived organisms. This is Harriet the tortoise, who died, I think it was 2007. This was discovered by the beagle. the crew of the Beagle that Darwin was on in the Galapagos as a young tortoise. And they brought it back. He ended up, or she ended up in Australia and lived, well over 100 years, and just died recently. So tortoises live a very long time. Certain lobsters, it's not clear that they actually ever die of old age. They usually are caught or eaten or something. They don't even start producing children or baby lobsters until several years later than most organisms do. So apparently, and these are all evolutionary strategies for survival. So the point of this is that in some organisms, living a very, very long time has been something that's evolved. So it's not impossible that other organisms might be able to institute that. This is something called a water bell or a pterodactyl. Water bear, that's a microscopic little animal creature that lives in pond water. And these guys also seem to be immortal. They get usually eaten, something happens to them, but they don't appear to age beyond a certain point. They've even taken these little guys into space, and they've exposed them to a vacuum. They shut down, and when you put them back in their environment, they reawaken. So there's some pretty tough little creatures. So how do you get radical life extension? In this book, I talk about 4 different areas. There's health and hygiene, which you don't think about in the context of all this cool technology, but this has actually gotten us where we are now. We've more than doubled lifespan since the late 19th century if you start with birth. Even if you start at age 5 or age 10, we're living a lot longer and a lot healthier. And this is what's gotten us here. It's not technology, if you look at all the data. It's really people eating better, cleanliness, things like that. So that's gotten us this far, and it's still a major part of how we would extend our own lives. This is Hugh Hare, who I mentioned earlier, that designs, this is some of the legs he's designed, but bionics is another way. Again, as our human parts begin to break down, we could potentially in the future replace them. Genetics is a big one, and then the stem cell technologies, literally regrowing. And this is a cornea. I saw, not from this picture, but I actually saw a gentleman who had his corneas damaged. He'd been blind for several years, had never actually even seen his children. And they took some stem cells from his eye, and they grew corneas and surgically implanted them. And the first thing he saw was his daughter. And he actually even got a driver's license with lenses, with glasses. He can actually see okay. It's sort of amazing. And again, these technologies could be used to enhance as well. So, how did your vote come out compared to 50,000 people? Drum roll? Anyway. Sorry. You all were, of course, quite different because we're at a body hacking conference. You can almost reverse this. The forever is only about 3%. The 80 years is the vast majority of people. And it's interesting because I think people are very conservative when they start thinking of their own lives and how this might shake out with technology. We only had 10% at 150 and 29%. Now, there's an online survey that you can take at whenim164.com if you all want to take it. It's an ongoing survey. And I need to update the slide because this is actually quite a while ago. But the forever people tend to vote a lot on this, whereas the 80-year people don't. So it's creeping up. It's now at about 6 or 7%. So anyway, kind of just an interesting, this is very informal. It's just raising hands like you did. So what does the science say right now about life expectancy even without this technology? This is the UN predictions, and you can see in about 150 years, the trajectory we've been on since 1900, and this is without enhancements. This is just basically the good food and technology, or good food and hygiene with some of the technology thrown in. And you can see it begins to level off for women in the developed world, which is the way they count these things, will be up close to 100 in 150 years. So we will actually continue to increase life expectancy even without these really radical technologies. So 1900, it was 47 years old, and 2150, 95 years old. So the final part here, why or why not would you want to live to be 150 years old? And we did a survey when I had a little program at UC Berkeley called the Center for Life Science Policy, and we actually did these aren't really that formal either, but it was a paper survey. We sent it out. So here's what people put down. People that wanted to live to be 150, they could spend more time with their loved ones. This, again, my family. Hopefully they would also, if there was some technology involved, would indulge in the technology, and so you all live a little longer. You might have time to do something that you'd always meant to do but didn't have time, like learn to play the piano, get a PhD, whatever. Albert Einstein would actually still be alive if you had technologies that could have kept him alive and he was living to be 150. Steve Jobs might still be with us. Who knows what he would say about this new controversy with the iPhone. And my favorite one is you get to see the future. I mean, I'm really curious. I'm not sure I really want to live like 100 years to find out, but I would really like, as a historian, I am fascinated, of course, with the future as well. So what is it going to look like? This is what people in the 50s thought it would look like now. Obviously, that is not very accurate. So what's going to happen? And then you get to why people wouldn't want to, and there's actually a longer list here. This is the oldest woman that we know of that's ever lived. Her name was Jean Claudeau. She died in 1997 at 123 years old. But people don't want to be old and frail longer. Many of these technologies may help you stay, not die in the time span you would have, but you're going to be old and frail longer, and a lot of people, that's what they imagine living longer to be about. And in fact, that is what happens now, mostly. And because it's about, as they say, health span, not lifespan, how healthy you are. How are you going to pay for it? You might be riding high now, but we all know things can happen. Recessions. In fact, then there's the resource question. If everybody suddenly stopped dying, how would that shake out in terms of population and resources? You have these little pesky things called dictators and wars and horrible things that can happen if you live longer. Wars, plague, this is Superstorm Sandy. All these things you have more of a risk. And by the way, this isn't me saying this. This is what people were worried about. So we had a whole list of things, and then we asked them to add things. Some of these I hadn't even thought of, like Superstorm Sandy. Survey was taken not long after that, and a lot of them put that down. And then love. How many times does that first kiss with your new whatever mean something? Or how many times can you be married? 20, 30, maybe, who knows? Anyway, these will all be questions that will, come up if you radically extend lifespan. And then a lot of people put boredom, which I was surprised about. I'm try to keep myself from being bored, but a lot of people were worried about that. You live 1,000 years, you get bored. Then finally, I want to tell you about a little project that I'm doing called ARC, and we're trying to make some of these new things happen. And this is our little... So it's a community of innovators, basically, trying to solve some of these problems around this fusion idea. And this age of fusion is health, IT, and biomedicine, trying to combine all this, plus politics, laws, economics, all these other things that are important. Again, on the economics, this fusion market's around $4 trillion. And we have this little process we're trying to put together to solve problems which involve convening, informing, and building. And you saw, actually, my colleague David Webster yesterday speaking from IDEO, and ARC and IDEO have just started a collaboration to try to bring all of this world, these silos and everything together in our own small way. We're very small. And these are some of the topics we deal with in meetings all over the world, some of the speakers we've had. We're launching the ARC Fusion magazine soon online, and we would love people to join us. And I'll end with this quote, which I'm sure you all know, but it's still my favorite. The future is already here, which is not very evenly distributed. And these are the two books I've mentioned, When I'm 164 and Experimental Man. There are websites devoted to each of them. And thank you. So I went slightly over, but maybe we have...
We have time for questions.
Good.
And we've got people asking them.
Great. Yeah. When the transition to the microphone, I missed. Yeah.
As long as it hurt, but a few things might have hurt you a little. So I'm curious what those were and what you avoided.
Well, the major thing I found out, and this started, by the way, with a Wired story, but way back in 2002 when I had myself sequenced right after the Human Genome Project. What I mostly found out was a surprise, which is I don't have most things. And in fact, that's the way most of us who are, survive to adulthood, you'll find out you don't have most things, which is kind of good news. But, I was at risk for hypertension. I was at risk for heart disease. Some of the, non-genetic or things like I was a distance endurance runner, and my knees are shot, which I kind of knew already. But when I saw that in an MRI scan, my knees looked like somebody had taken a hammer and pounded them. And I was still running, and I stopped running and that was sort of preventive. So there were a few things like that I learned. But I'm a pretty healthy person. I come from a pretty long-lived family, which is one reason I could probably do this. Several of my friends, who have things running in their families were like, are you crazy? I don't even want to know. So.
Yeah, I'm curious about the data. You said that there's a lot of data you're collecting. There's a lot of data that we can start collecting. But really, in order to make sense of that, we're going to have to make that available. I mean, so there's a part of privacy issues. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about your own personal data being out there for investigation? So in order to allow us to kind of gather that, and also the general population, how much are we willing to be radically transparent about all of this data that we're starting to collect in order to the benefit of understanding?
The whole privacy issue is something that is absolutely fascinating, and I'm in mixed feelings about this myself. I mean, I know this is open science community, but the reality is I don't think we can really, this will be hacked, and everything, once it's digital, no matter, how you encrypt it, at some point it will. And there are people that talk about, maybe all our data should be available to everyone, which will be somewhat protected. There's a lot of transparency there. The problem with that is that we all have different data. And some people might, have more serious data that you wouldn't want your employer, other people to know. So I think that's a tough one. But we're going to have to confront it. We've done it with other aspects of life. And I think probably the only way to control it is to have some pretty severe laws around the abuse or access to the data. I hope that answers your question. Yep.
Yeah, I had a question about, our life extension over the millennia has really been a natural extension that you referred to, food, better food, hygiene, and those types of things. When you look at the technologies that you referred to, a lot of those are rehab type technologies where people are missing limbs, amazing things that happen there. Where do you see that crossing? You showed the human extension, this improvement of life. I mean, capitalism and the ability to create food has saved 100 billion, or, 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. These are amazing things just in normal things. And then you've got these technologies that currently are applied to people who have deficits. And then you think that those are going to be applied to people who are going to choose them. I find that hard to believe. You're better off just eating better and exercise.
You're asking about where is the societal kind of acceptance of this going to cross?
Well, where is it technologically going to be feasible? There's a societal thing. There's a lot of issues around this. It's like, okay, well, this is going to happen, but really, when, how, what's the forces?
Well, the economics is tricky because it's highly probable that, like most technologies, these will be available to only a few people who can afford them. And we've had this progression of technology, for decades now, where you start with rich people, like mobile phones were really bad when they came out. Only rich people could afford them, and now everybody has them. So you could follow that trajectory. It's hard to tell because a lot of medical technology actually does not lower costs. It actually becomes more expensive the more technology you add. And there's some weird and interesting economic reasons why that happens. So it's really hard to tell. You hope it follows that scaling technology or the scaling process that other technology like smartphones. So we'll have to see on that. Right now, it's all rather expensive. And some of it you can begin to do like I described. I didn't put up the slide, but all of this I got done around 2009. When the book came out, it cost around $150,000. I didn't pay that because I got everybody to do it for me. It'd probably be about $18,000 now. So even those things that I had tested, which don't really affect your life extension, but that's where you would begin, those are incredibly expensive. And society, I think, is still not, most people outside of this room are not focusing on what these technologies can possibly bring us. And we'll have, it gets into the realm of politics. Anyway, I'm not going to get political here, but there are still some technologies that are really old that politically are still, have some challenges and controversy around. So I think we have a lot of work to do on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Which is, I think, more so than almost any other conference you would have given this talk at. This is the experimental project.
Right, exactly.
And I'd like you to give us a few ideas where if people out here wanted to start with the same kind of journey we've been on, where would you tell them to begin?
I would start, I wouldn't have said this not long ago, but you can certainly start with genetics. There are a number of companies, and you should know the caveats that I presented to you, but you can learn a few things from genetics. Most of the tests I took, if you have a lot of money, you could take, but it would be difficult to actually replicate the deeper stuff. But there are a lot of other things. I mean, some of these were pretty regular tests. Some of them were relatively cheap. Some of the things that you were showing here, you're beginning to get from, it's like a ground up. The stuff I did was mostly from medical people and, the established technologists and things. But the DIY movement and all of that is, I think, going to create cheaper alternatives. And it still has a little ways to go, to get to sort of medical grade. But all the things we're seeing here, just keep going, basically. Keep doing it. Yeah.
Keep documenting it.
Yeah.
Any last questions? Another big thank you.
Thank you.
Every speaker thus far has at least had a portion of their talk that related to relationships.
Yeah.
And yours did too. I'm not talking about increasing life, I'm talking about increasing quality of life all the way around. And I'm wondering what your knowledge is about people that are using this technology to study relationships.
Yeah, obviously we're talking about quality of life, and I mentioned even, probably the biggest reason that people wouldn't want to live to be 150. They don't want to be old and frail. They do think a lot about things like relationships. I mean, we're living longer now. We see, our parents, even ourselves, living healthy a lot longer, and so some of these other issues come into play. But that's really what it's all about. I mean, I have no interest in, just because technology allows me persisting for decades in a kind of old, frail body, or even a partially constructed body. I mean, which might happen. I mean, you might have bionics here, a stem cell generated, esophagus or whatever it is, but your brain is still aging, and none of this is going to happen all at once. So I think the quality of life, I'm glad you brought that up, is really important for all aspects, relationships, who you are, all of that. So.